A new study from the Pembina Institute, down but not out, reviews how Alberta government policies have chilled investment in the provincial wind and solar industry and suggests ways to fix the rules in order to unlock billions in new power generation investment. I spoke to senior analyst Jason Wang about Pembina's concerns: reclamation securities that apply only to wind and solar projects, electricity market design changes that disadvantage those projects, and looming transmission access surcharges. But there's a bigger problem here than just regulation changes the renewable industry doesn't like. That problem is the Alberta government's antagonism to change. The electricity industry worldwide is in the midst of a technological revolution. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries get the headlines, but the transformation is much deeper than that. New technologies are changing the type of energy we use, how we create it, and how we use it. Governments and regulators are grappling with how to manage and harness a rapidly changing industry that is at the heart of every economy. Alberta pretends that the energy world is not changing, that Alberta is somehow different, exceptional in some way, and that it will sit out the energy transition. Thank you very much. Think of this interview with Wang as a case study in how governments can protect incumbent actors, like utilities, and impede changes that may be inconvenient in the short term, but in the long term are necessary to remain economically competitive. Welcome to the interview, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Well, Pembina Institute has released a new report, down but not out. It's just out, as it were, and we're talking about the moratorium on renewables that it lasted 7 months, started in August 2023, went to February of 2024, and your report argues that the government is the rules are going in the wrong direction. You suggest some changes to the rules to bring back investment in wind and solar within Alberta. Maybe you could just, summarize the report for us.
Yeah, so since the moratorium was placed on wind and solar energy and hydro, geothermal, many sources, many types of renewable energy, in 2023, we at Pembina Institute thought it's important to really contextualize this for Albertans, right? This sector is growing. It was one of the fastest growing sectors, and we were leading the country in this type of energy development. But it's something that it hasn't been the predominant industry for decades, right? So we really wanted to contextualize what this meant, what the impacts were for Albertans, and we this is now I believe our third report, really looking at what has the impact been using the same methodology. And this time around in 2024, in 2025, after all of 2024, we were really able to see a big change in the project development queue. And we saw for the first time actually that the number of projects proposed has gone down. So I want to be clear about what that means. Generally projects leave the queue, when they're built, for example. But so many projects have been canceled now, and so few projects have been proposed that the overall amount of new projects proposed has gone down. And we were interested in, is this a global trend? Is this or is this just Alberta, right? And so we compared the growth in the queue, or the shrinkage in the queue, to Australia and Texas, two very comparable jurisdictions with similar markets. And Texas is bigger. And sorry, we didn't look at all of Australia. We looked at South Australia, the state of South Australia, which is a little smaller than Alberta. And we found that the queues in those jurisdictions continue to grow. So more projects are being proposed than being built or being canceled.
Yeah, we talk to experts all over the world, and you can point to any number of jurisdictions, number of them down in the United States. And why are they adopting wind and solar? It's when I sit on the U.S. Energy Association's technical briefing panel as a journalist, and we get American electricity executives in all the time, utilities, regulators, and so on, and they're absolutely desperate to get generation capacity into their system because they're growing by like 3, 4, 5% a year after 2 decades of flat demand. So wind and solar are cheap and you get them to up and running within a couple of years, which is exactly what they need. And that's why they want to do it. Not everybody within, if you got 50 states, as you can imagine, you've got some like Texas and California that are at the front of the curve. They're innovators, they're early adopters, they're really aggressive. And then you've got a whole bunch that are over on the other end of the curve, they're laggards, and they're just not moving as quickly. And I think what's unique about Alberta is it went from being an innovator, at the front of the curve in Canada for sure, and all the way over to the other side of the curve, it appears.
Yeah, and the main reason for that really is Alberta has some of the best renewable energy resources in the country, Alberta and Saskatchewan. But Alberta's market structure had been more amenable for renewable energy developers to be able to propose projects, right? To enter the market. So I certainly think that there's still an opportunity. That's the down but not out part of our report, where we really wanted to point out to the government of Alberta, there are some changes that they've been making that, have been conducive, have been supportive of grid modernization, but they've only been very small steps. There are other restrictions that they've been putting in that are true barriers and huge sources of uncertainty, especially the reclamation rules and many elements of the market restructuring. It's giving uncertainty not just to renewables developers but to all electricity generators. But our point is there is an opportunity for Alberta to be a leader again, and not just a leader in building, wind and solar to reduce the cost of consumers' electricity, which will happen, but also to become, a place that's prosperous with abundant clean energy that can power new industries, right? Like the data centers that Alberta's hoping to attract for industrial decarbonization. Clean energy is not just for powering our light bulbs and our smartphones or electric vehicles. It's also going to be key to the future economy of producing clean steel, aluminum, cement, even, right? Many sorts of industrial products.
Yeah, let's make a point here. This is an emerging global trend. It's not like it's the standard around the world yet, but this is the arc of the trend, and that is if you're manufacturing something, you will have a supply chain. And in that supply chain, you're asking your suppliers to lower their emissions intensity of their products, whatever the inputs that you're buying from them. And that is happening more and more around the world. So those industries, those manufacturing industries that have access to like hydro or nuclear or wind and solar, where the emissions are zero or very low, the emissions intensity of their products are very low, and that gives them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So if there are industries in Alberta that are manufacturing things, but they're buying electricity that's made with natural gas, yes, it's cleaner than coal by half, but it's still not all that clean. And that could lead to a competitive disadvantage to Alberta manufacturers or others who are in supply chains.
Mhm.
Is that not correct? I mean,
No,
that's happening
that's
elsewhere. Is that
that,
that's an accurate observation, is it not?
no, that's certainly true, and we're seeing many of Canada's trading allies implement credit border adjustment mechanisms, right? So essentially saying, uh, they have industrial carbon pricing standards, and if imports aren't meeting those, they'll adjust them to meet them. So uh, essentially, yes, the emissions intensity matters not just for, you know, companies and shareholders, but also for other jurisdictions when they're looking at what products are being imported to their their ports. I also want to point out, though, it's not actually just an emissions intensity advantage. Often there is a price advantage too to using clean electricity. One of the main reasons that companies have been signing long-term power purchase agreements with renewable, especially wind and solar projects, is it provides price certainty over, you know, 10 to 20 some years. All these contracts differ, but most of the time, these contracts offer a better, a more competitive price than uh, just being exposed to, you know, the fossil heavy um, electricity market that's, you know, fundamentally tied to the global price of oil and gas, right? That's vulnerable to geopolitical risks. And we saw that in the last couple of years.
There are three changes that the Alberta government has made here that I want to talk about specifically. Transmission access surcharges are coming. Can you tell us about those?
Uh, so these are still in draft. If you mean the optimal transmission planning framework, which is what the government of Alberta is calling them, for new generators, they're essentially saying for uh, any new power plant that wants to be connected to the grid, there will be some assessment of how much that power plant is causing new transmission lines to be built. And we don't know what the final framework for that is going to be. Um, you know, some jurisdictions just set a rule to say, for example, generators pay 25%, sometimes 50%. So far, Alberta's approach is still vague. It's still unclear exactly what that is, but it could be quite onerous for projects. Um, and it's not, or it's also not entirely clear, you know, what the justification for this policy is in our view. You know, transmission build out to renewables that brings the cost of electricity down for consumers. The total cost of delivered electricity will lower because the cost of wind and solar is so low. Even with that transmission build out, you'll end up saving on electricity costs. So, you know, that's one area where we think the government should be encouraging wind and solar and transmission build out.
Let's talk about the recycling and reclamation securities that are applied to renewables. Now, there's a certain irony involved here in that Alberta government on the oil and gas side has specifically rejected security upfront or reclamation fees upfront. And they did that going back to 1938, the beginning of the founding of the first energy regulator in Alberta. And it seems kind of unfair that somehow wind and solar are required for these, um, that they provide security up front.
Yeah, you know, it is unclear still what the final rules are going to be. On reclamation security, our understanding is, you know, by this Saturday, we should have clear rules. But you know, you're absolutely right about the main point of this. There is a difference in approach to these requirements. To Alberta hasn't required similar reclamation security for you know, any other energy industry to our knowledge. Um, you know, these are going to be uh, probably um, quite impactful for renewable energy development because so much of that development is already you know, upfront capital heavy rather than, you know, operationally intensive. So uh, yeah, it is concerning. And you know, in our view, we try to look at reclamation issues to the best of our ability, right? We absolutely agree that reclamation rules are important. It is important to reclaim uh, any industrial development to make sure that our land is is most usable or is best usable as possible. But yeah, these new rules that they've introduced or talked about for renewable energy, the government said, only one time maybe they'll look at these for other sectors too. And I'm also including in here, viewscape impacts. Many sorts of developments have impacts on those. And ultimately, I think what's most important for the government of Alberta is to clearly articulate what the policy problems are and how to how to solve all of those problems. Right now, it does seem to be singling out just the wind and solar sectors.
Right. Let's wrap up the interview this way, Jason. You alluded earlier to electricity market design changes. Now, one of the things I've learned in covering this sector is that market design is not for the faint of heart. If you're not a technical expert, it can be a daunting task to understand how markets are designed and why they function the way they do. Could you give us a simple explanation of the changes that the government has made to Alberta's energy only market?
So to be clear, there are no final changes yet. These are all still currently in deliberation, and even as recently as last month, have still seen substantial changes. The initial intent was to essentially create what's called a day-ahead market for um, for generators to say this is what I will be able to provide tomorrow. Um, Essentially, it's a sort of capacity guarantee or a capacity commitment. Um, but the government has now walked back from that. And so, it's unclear exactly what that part's going to look like. It seems like actually it'll stay quite similar to the market we currently have. Um, the other changes are, more ancillary services are being proposed. Hopefully, this will be good for things like energy storage and interties as well. But what we're still missing from the energy market restructuring conversation is things like distributed energy resources or demand side management resources. Are these going to be, are these modern technologies going to be able to be a part of Alberta's electricity system? Those are critical for maintaining flexibility. Last year we wrote another report called I'll have what excuse me called I'll have what they're having, and it was about what can we learn from global leaders who've implemented way more wind and solar than Alberta has, and still maintained a reliable and affordable grid. And what we saw was they implemented exactly those things: interties, storage, demand side management, demand response, but things that enable flexibility on grids. So Alberta's energy market restructuring hasn't, uh, you know, explicitly prioritized flexibility in that way. Neither has it prioritized uh, reducing emissions from the system. It might be able to help improve some reliability outcomes, but it's really important in our view to be tackling all of those challenges simultaneously.
I've talked to enough utility executives and regulators and industry executives from around the world. There are very clearly there's a model emerging of a modernized power grid that incorporates all sorts of technologies, and you mentioned a bunch of them. Demand side response, batteries, and there's a whole pile of stuff we haven't talked about. But by integrating those, spending money on the capital now, upgrading your grid, you actually can integrate a lot more of the low cost wind and solar and have a better, more flexible, lower cost grid. And so this is not, we're not in the realm of this is coming, it's here. Then there's more stuff coming, by the way, but more technology that's rolling out all the time. This is a time of tremendous technological change in the utility industry. Nevertheless, the technology that's out there is mature enough now that you can build a modern grid that can incorporate all sorts of different generation. It can keep the gas as much as required, and cogeneration up in the oil sands, and wind and solar, and buy some hydro, and all sorts of things, and you can put it in, and that's where Alberta is kind of falling down. It's taking a very piecemeal approach to this, and not wanting to change very quickly. So anyway, on that note,
Yeah,
Jason, thank you very
I
much. Do you want? I'll let you
no,
respond to
I
that.
do want to, yeah, just very quickly, I think you're right, Markham. And uh, yeah, these technologies are proven. Alberta could be making the most use of these. Alberta is, unique in many ways, but fundamentally, these physics of electricity grids don't change that drastically depending on where you are in the world, right? The same laws apply. Flexibility is important, and these technologies work the same in other places as here. And of course, yeah, we'll have local contexts, but those are the problems we should be trying to solve. But we're not really even venturing down that path yet. The last thing I just want to say right now is there are a lot of conversations about what Canada's economic future, right? And I think most of our leaders, political leaders, think that are quite united on thinking that we are an energy superpower. Energy is part of our uh, economic strength, but in our view, just in the same way as when you have a grid uh, that has underutilized resources that you should be optimizing and using more of. Every province, including Alberta, has so many resources that it needs to be tapping to, right? Like Alberta should be maximizing its use of clean, especially renewable energy sources. It should be figuring out how to find more ways to integrate as much as it can onto the grid. And that means adding flexibility, adding transmission, adding interties. But it really is incumbent in our view on Alberta to step up and play a role too in this national conversation about creating a resilient and secure economic future for the whole country. And of course, it's going to bring benefits to all of us here at home too. So uh, definitely wanted to just point out, yeah, there's a great national conversation, but I agree with you. Alberta does need to step up its game.
Indeed. Jason, thank you very much for this.
Yeah. Thank you, Markham.